Hi listeners, this is Karl-James Langford on channel 01 to 1975. This is my Archaeology of Religion, part 2. This week we look at Roman temples, and next week we look at Egyptian temples. So let's go into those Roman temples in our wonderful land of Britain. Examples in England, Wales and Scotland. None as of yet in Ireland, unfortunately, my Irish listeners. So, a number of Roman sites in Britain have the added attachment of a Roman temple. When you think of the concept of a Roman temple, you need to think of the concept of something very different from Roman temples that you would see, for example, in Rome, which we've got images coming up. They're very much in the local genre, in the idea of Pax Romana. This first illustration is of a typical Roman temple form, and the greyed out area in the centre is known as a cella, spelt C-E-L-L-A. In Latin, C is pronounced with a K, for those who don't know. Most of the Roman temple sites in Britain, we don't know which god that they were attributed to. One of these sites, known as Bourton Grounds in Buckingham, excavated in the 1960s, we see that the site is attributed to Isis. It's attributed to Isis and it dates to the middle of the 300s. Lucky that we've got a god attributed to this site because a statue was found there. Here's a reconstruction of the site at Bourton Grounds in Buckingham, and one interesting thing is that the centralised cella is also raised to allow light into it. On ground floor level you wouldn't be allowed to look inside the cella. The cella was the sacred area, the domain of the priest. One interesting thing I'll quickly interject is that many of these temple sites in England and Wales eventually become church sites, and the form of the temple is to be very much seen as being copied by very early Christian churches. These next images are of Breen Down in Somerset. You'll find that lots of sites were excavated in the 1840s and 1950s. This example was excavated in 1957, 1958, basically because of the genre of archaeology interested in excavating Roman sites. This also dates to the 300s, the middle 300s. By about 395, most of these sites had been converted or abandoned, with the onset of Christianity being the one religion in the Roman Empire. Quickly look at these images. Lots of stone masonry survive at foundation level. It's probably because our temples weren't completely constructed out of stone. Most of them were more likely to have had stone on the base level and wattle of daub on the upper levels. And some more reconstruction drawings of that and how it would have looked. Next we look at the reconstructed drawing by Alan Sorrell. Great guy, used to go around the country doing colour illustrations of castle sites in Wales and various sites across the country and in England as well. He illustrated this site at Caerwent, showing that the temple itself is in the core of the city, probably constructed on an earlier site, but this stone site was constructed in the 330s. Look at the level of archaeology that still survives at the site. 1.5 meters, going up to 2 meters of Roman archaeology down to foundation level excavated there. The cella, as you can see in the centre, with this apsidal type structure pointing northways. And this is interesting, this sort of apsidal structure and that central form of the cella, other than the precinct going around the outside, you can refer to the other zone around the centralised cella as a temenassos or ambulatory. Words can have different meanings in that, so nobody try and correct me on that one because they've got different meanings. But if you look at that, you can see the very early form of many early churches, particularly in the Anglo-Saxon period, going into the Roman period as well. Very interesting site, on display still at Caerwent. The next image takes us to Chanctonbury in West Sussex, another site that I've actually visited. You can actually see the form on this aerial plan view. Many temple sites seem to have occupied these wonderful Iron Age sites. We know that 99.9% of all Iron Age hill fort sites showed no signs of any conflict at all. So they're quite peaceful now. This one at Chanctonbury is very peaceful. Again, at Chanctonbury in West Sussex, what you can see is this site would have been positioned on the former Iron Age hill fort, probably dedicated to a local god as well. God, the attribution we don't know of today. Looking at this site as well, it would have occupied the hill fort, which would have been used as a large grain store and animal store in the Iron Age period. Basically, the ditches were just to show off and to protect the animals. And when the Romans actually got to these sites, they would have actually purchased the grain, because there's no point having the local people setting fire to all the grain when the Roman army needed it. So it was a bit of a trade-off. We want to buy your grain, and in return you can live peacefully in the Roman Empire. And why don't you use some of your land and construct a villa, which would act as a grain store, which would be made in the Roman form. Central storage depot would be much more useful as a site within the Roman administration, within the local landscape. Hence why lots of hill forts weren't used again, other than for these temple dedications. There was usually an amalgam of local gods and Roman gods. This next example is at Farley. You can just notice that there's a signpost there. This site itself was excavated in 1848, and in other dates after that. There's pre-Roman coins being found at this date, and you can see the little bits of Keller sticking out in the centre, the zone around the outside, the Blutzery, for example, the zone around the outside, dating all the way down to the 350s. As I say, most of these sites all date to the mid-350s, AD 350s, and being replaced then by 395 under the edict of Theodosius, that the only religion in the empire in 395 was to be Christianity. Next example is the site at Gosbecks Park. We've got two examples at Colchester in Essex, excavated in 1842. What's 5 years, monks friends? 1842, and this site itself is a very large temple site. The wall itself, the outer precinct wall, that's Messos itself, is 340 metres from start to finish in a square. Centralised keller in the centre, dating all the way to the 350s, and it's part of the Gosbecks Park complex. So you can actually see where the temple is actually laid out on the ground, along with other monuments at the site. So a wonderful sort of a project at Colchester to actually give a public park to the remains of the archaeology there. It's not the only temple that we actually find in Colchester. This temple site in Gosbecks Park is dedicated to Camelos, hence given its name to Camelon Junum, otherwise known as Colchester today. Lovely reconstructed drawing there. Beautiful temple with the Keller quite dwarfed by the Tomossos precinct wall around the outside. Moving now on to the great Temple of Claudius. Claudius, the Roman Emperor Claudius, was a living god. This temple was probably dedicated in 47, AD 47, 4 years after Claudius had invaded Britain with his legions, and in 470 he was dedicated as a god for his great victory in Britain and bringing it into the Roman Empire. Not so many deaths the history books tell us in accounts of the locals, because we needed them within the Roman Empire to man the land and farm the land. One interesting thing, there is death and destruction in this image. AD 61, 62, there were great revolts of the local peoples, various tribes in the local peoples, given the umbrella name of the Iceni. Below, loads of other local tribes were involved. Given the name, the Boudiccan revolt. Whether Boudica actually existed as a person is up for debate, but certainly St Mortimer Wheeler would have argued that she did exist. This site was excavated probably in the 1840s as well. Not sure of that, but you can see the site is being flamed there by the local people. There's the form of the temple. It doesn't have a surrounding zone. It's just got the main temple. Now this goes against all the other sites in Britain other than Bath in that it's a wonderful classical form of temple, not to be found anywhere else in Britain other than Bath. Beautiful columns, but when it was burnt down, it was probably replaced by a local god and deity. The attribution of a Roman emperors as god isn't uncommon, but this as an example in Britain is very rare and unique other than other examples that might be seen in London if we can find them. This site itself is very important. Beautiful vaults under the castle. The vaults of the original temple still survive, where the people would have heralded themselves in whilst they were trying to sanctum, and they all died and probably burnt to death, and then their skeletal remains were ground down by the local rebuilding of the city to actually be used in local mortar. So they didn't die in vain. There's the castle itself, built directly. The lower courses, other than the circular apsidal type structure, which isn't of the Roman temple initially, probably later, but the ground levels are in fact the original Roman temple. Moving on to another example. This is a Great Chesterford. Great Chesterford, excavated in 1847. Don't know the dedication, dating to the 350s. 2 mosaic floors were actually found in the centralised cellar. Beautiful views of the landscape, as you can actually see. And this is an example in Essex, Great Chesterford. This example here is known as Jordan Hill, excavated in 1843. And see, the thing is with Jordan Hill, is that we do have an interesting site in that there's other things associated with it, going back to an early stage. This is like probably a very early temple into the noughties all the way through to the 350s. Most of these sites of the reconstruction cannot be seen on ground level today, just like this example at Lancing in West Sussex. Previously the Jordan Hill site in Dorset. There's probably a little bit more to it than the example at Lancing in West Sussex, but we've got a bit of a reconstruction here. Next, the exciting site with all this, which is also on public display under type of hangar. This site itself is very interesting. The people who were living in this villa in the 400s after the Edict of Theodosius and before hedged their bets. The water deity gods were to be worshipped in a cellar below ground floor level. There you go, you've got the cellar there, and water deities were worshipped. Sort of nymphium type gods and little water deities with little statues there and all the rest of it. Above ground level, however, they reverted to Christianity in this Chio Rio design to be seen on early shields. So if anyone has seen any illustrations of the legendary or mythical King Arthur, you'll see that this is on his shield, and you see this represented in a number of those films of the ilk. This site itself is one of those sites that actually brings us to greatness in archaeology, not in the sense of the Romans, but brings us to Sir Mortimer Wheeler. Another example that has the Sir Mortimer Wheeler ilk when you look at Colchester as well. Excavated in the 1920s with Sir Mortimer Wheeler. The site itself is quite extensive. The ruins to be seen above ground level, and well worth a visit. This is a reconstruction of the temples at one of the temples at Lydney Park in Gloucestershire, and you can get in there. A bit pricey to go around and see, but this is one of those sites that doesn't restrict normal muggles access. The cellar itself was to prevent people access, where the doors would open outwards, there'd be a blind behind, nobody'd be able to see, and the priest would wait at the steps. You'd give him a little offertory statue or a cursed tablet or something which would be put in water, and then he would take these in the temple. You'd never ever see what he was doing. He's probably sitting in there having a fag, but except cigarettes weren't invented by that stage. Lydney Park itself, a very interesting site, and the other thing as well is with these sites, they had large precincts around the outside, so you'd buy little statues you'd give to the priest. Then the next day, the statue would be put back on sale. There's me being cynical. Another example of a hill fort here, Maiden Castle in Dorset. Temple itself is built smack bang in the middle of this great sort of hill fort, coming up to 50 acres in area, one of the biggest hill forts in Britain. Interesting thing about this temple is that unless you know it's there, you go around the hill fort, you don't see it, and it's sort of hidden. The walls themselves, when excavated, about 2 meters in height. You can see some of the walls here about 1 meter above level. Molehills full of Roman pottery, well worth a visit. And this had a wonderful view of the landscape, painted white. You could see it for miles around. Tribulation of local gods with Roman gods. This site, next site here, is at Nettleton in Wiltshire. You notice that lots of these sites are spread around the country. We're yet to get to the ones in the north, but we will. Nettleton in Wiltshire, dedicated to the Temple of Apollo, very close to water, and also there might be the local god Cunnimaglus, also dedicated at the site. So Apollo and Cunnimaglus dedicated at the site. Moving on, there's, as we say, lots to get on with, and the Nettleton site gives way to Pagan's Hill, which was excavated by the archaeologist Philip Ratz in 1949. Again, it's into the 1953. As you can see on the plan, had a bit of a well, maybe linked with water, but also linked with the god Mercury. Probably a large timber build, but it's believed by Ratz's evidence that we've got occupation at the site, domestic occupation taken over the temple into the 400s. So, we've got some activity after that, but obviously Christianity, does Christianity survive? Well, Christianity wouldn't have shown any signs in the archaeology, unfortunately. Because it was one of those religions in the early stage that didn't use statues and all the rest of it. So there you go. This is a site at Ratham Mill in West Sussex, and it's only to be seen in aerial photographs and on level, excavated at the site. The site at Pagan Hill, that was an octagonal temple. We've got no image of this site. Unlike the previous site, this site would have been square. The previous site, if you didn't notice, was octagonal in area. So they not only had square rectangular temples, they had octagonal and circular temples. As excavated in an episode with Time Team, where they excavated 3 square temples. They excavated 1 circular temple at the wonderful site that Time Team excavated in Series 16, Episode 6, The Trouble with Temples, at Friars Wash in Hertfordshire, which we don't have any illustrations of, but well worth a visit if you go on YouTube. As I say, Friars Wash, Series 16, Episode 6 of Time Team. Get out and watch that. Good thing about Roman temples, where they find 4 Roman temple sites in close proximity. Again, example that Roman temple sites didn't come in ones. Now, we have another temple site at Willington. We don't have an illustration of the site at Willington. One thing we will say about the Willington Temple, there are crop marks there. The example of Willington shown as an aerial photograph here today. The site. This is dedicated to Epona, and probably didn't last into the Christian period. Epona would have been seen in the figure of a figure on a horse. And this is to be seen in an example that comes from the continent, dedicated to Epona. Other dedications at the site probably to Mercury and Minerva and other gods, a pantheon of gods worshipped at the site. Finally, on this list, before we get to the big one, we've got Wood Eaton in Oxfordshire. This was again excavated in the 1950s, in 1952. As you can see through the aerial photograph here, you can actually clearly see from the aerial photograph that there's the centralised cellar there. And at this site we found a number of votive offerings. This all dates all the way to the 350s, and the votive offerings tell us of statuary. The statuary itself tells us of the god Venus. Venus is dedicated at the site. Also, there are various votive offerings being thrown into the temple. We usually find bits of lead and bronze, usually broken, thrown into wells and watercourses. Usually, we've got these two statues, votive statues, but there would be many more at the site. What you can see is that little miniature spear there, which would have been deliberately broken. And the idea of deliberately breaking things is to be seen when we break things in Iron Age society, snap things and break things like swords into rivers at Iron Age water deity sites. Now, this site itself was excavated very recently at 56 Gresham Street in London. Don't know the dedication of this site, but this is one of the most local and this is one of the most recent Roman sites to be excavated, which has a temple link in London, and obviously they're still being found. Now, what we go on to now is the example of the wonderful, we've got the examples of wonderful Mithraeum in London. And we've also got, coming on from that, we've got examples of the Roman temple in Bath. And we've got examples of Roman temples on Hadrian's Wall. So let's get on with this last bit. Let's look at the Roman temple in London, dedicated to Mithras. Now, the wonderful site at Mithras in London gives us a story of a site that was found in 1954. The Roman temple, when it was originally built, would have stood on the east bank of the now covered over River Walbrook, a key fresh water source in Roman Londinium. The site itself is associated with tokens being thrown in the River Walbrook, which we've actually found, and curse tablets as well. Curse tablets were those little tablets you would write in lead and you'd fold them over and you'd throw them into the river itself. The temple foundations are very close to other important sites in the City of London, and it was actually, when it was found in 1954, it was actually moved into another street because they wanted to save it and put it on public display. It's a Mithraeum dedicated to the Persian god Mithras, which had an underground, usually had an underground cellar type area, which were kept the main religious rituals out of view of the public, which the public would have been in the main temple above. Uncovered in September 1954 in response to London bombing and the rebuilding of London, they moved it to another street. They moved it to Temple Court, Queen Street. They moved it to Temple Court, Queen Victoria Street, London. This site, on the original site, they constructed a 14-storey building known as Buxbury House, which has now been demolished. So the Bloomsbury publishing magnate house has taken over the site, and what they wanted was to rededicate the temple back at its original home, so that it could actually display it. So that's what's actually being done now. The site's actually been moved and should be on display in 2016 when the Bloomsbury building is open to the public, and you can actually see Roman remains there. So it was moved in 1954 and it's been moved back to the site, in 2016. It would have been good if it would have stayed there in the first place. But, you know, what they want to do is show off the site and give it its sort of sense of history back. Wonderful things have been excavated at the site. Many objects that you can actually see in these illustrations. Little statues of Mithras, and this interesting statue here of Serapis. And it's a good piece of archaeology that I would sort of recommend anyone going to London to actually see. Moving on next to Roman Bath. The Roman Bath was one of these sites that was a Roman temple site as well, in the classical form. And this is interesting for us all, that you've got one of two big classical temple sites excavated. And actually this is on public view, in the sense that the large baths that you go around are actually what's left of this huge Roman temple complex. It would have had beautiful Corinthian order columns and capitals. And one thing you actually see dedicated at the site today is not only to Minerva, the site known as Aqua Siluri, not only dedicated to Minerva, but the site is actually dedicated to Janus, the god of entrances and exits, the god of the underworld. And he's to be seen on display at the site as well. Moving on now, Hadrian's Wall. We missed the northern sites. Excavated at Maryport in the 1800s was these wonderful altars, which these altars themselves have been added to very recently by other examples in recent excavations. Maryport itself is in Cumbria. It's part of the chain of defence of Hadrian's Wall, but it's a coastal fortification. And the site itself would have had its own garrison, would have had its own temple, and the whole point of the Roman temple was to, in relation to the Roman forts, these were temples of life. The sense of the temple of life, that you've got deities that are in the living, household gods, God that would help you if you were going into any form of conflict, if you were going to ride your horse that day. And Roman soldiers would have gone in these, lots of these altars were attributed to either gods, individuals, or the garrison themselves. You may put on these votive offerings such as baked bread, you might put a flagon of beer or ale, you might put anything on them. But this was very important for the Roman soldiers. They're going to reconstruct, they're not reconstructing, they're building a new museum at Maryport, which will display all the altars, including the recent ones, together, and indications that you'll be able to see them and not all sort of pushed into a corner of the old building, which they had been stored in up until that point. Examples at Hadrian's, actually at the stone bit of Hadrian's Wall now. This example is from Benwell, Newcastle upon Tyne. You can see that this form as well shows the idea that Christians would take for their idea of their chancel and their nave, with these two altars. And you've got a slab there, an altar. You could think that this is a very early type church, you know, but this starts its life off as a Roman temple. And it probably remains a Roman temple, but Roman soldiers later on at Hadrian's Wall into the 400s would have seen Christianity at this site. And the example here now is at Carraborough along Hadrian's Wall. Again, the idea that the site is open, Roman soldiers going in there, leaving dedications on the altars. Many of these examples, for example, at Vindolanda. We can see the reconstruction at Vindolanda, and the reconstruction at Vindolanda is based upon the typical form of a Roman temple, and various objects have been associated and found associated with the Roman temple at Vindolanda. Final map here showing various locations in Britain of the various sites. Some have been mentioned in this. And finally, just showing you these two examples that lots of Roman temples on the continent would have had their own mosaics on the floor. This is an example from Turkey, and the great Roman temple dedicated to the Emperor Hadrian at this example in Rome. Beautiful columns. Columns themselves don't exist standing anywhere like this in Britain, but the examples at Bath and the example at Colchester would have been as grand as this. So, talking about grandness, thank you very much for listening and watching these slides. We're looking at the Egyptians next week and at Egyptian temples. And let's have your comments, please. Thank you.